On the night of 14 July 2013, in the small town of Hartford, Wisconsin, a 19-year-old woman returned home after the cast party, celebrating the final performance of a local musical she had just taken part in. It had been an ordinary evening, the perfect end to a memorable night spent with friends. She would never wake up the next morning. Around midday, Jessie Blodgett was found in her bed by her own mother. The doors were still locked, with no signs of forced entry. Her bedroom appeared undisturbed, and investigators found no murder weapon at the scene. News spread quickly through the quiet town, where the last homicide had occurred nearly 3 decades earlier. Friends, family, and neighbors were all left asking the same question: who did this and why? In those first chaotic hours, one person arrived at the family home sooner than almost anyone else. They comforted Jessie's parents, cried alongside them, and shared cherished memories of Jessie just as any close friend would during such a heartbreaking time. Until a phone call came, asking that person to report to investigators. Just 16 days later, police had their answer, an answer that no one in the close-knit community could ever have imagined. Who was really responsible for the death of Jessie Blodgett? And how did a single offhand remark during an interview become the crucial clue that exposed the truth behind one of Wisconsin's most shocking murder cases in more than a decade? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story we'll bring you. Jessie Blodgett was born on 22 March 1994 and grew up in Hartford, Wisconsin, a small town where families had known one another for generations. She was the daughter of Buck and Joy Blodgett, raised in a household that valued the arts, music, and a strong commitment to the local community. From an early age, Jessie showed an exceptional gift for music. She earned a prestigious talent scholarship through school and devoted much of her time to singing and performing on stage. At the time of her death, she was a second-year student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, studying music education and theater with the dream of becoming a music teacher. Friends described Jessie as outspoken, compassionate, and deeply concerned about social issues. In the year or two before her death, she had begun speaking publicly about violence against women, a subject that, tragically, would later become inseparably linked to her own story. One of Jessie's closest friends, who had also been her boyfriend during their early high school years, came from a family that many in the community described as warm and caring. Jessie's father, Buck, later recalled how the two would sit together at school, writing songs and singing, and how that friend was always warmly welcomed whenever he visited their home. Although their teenage relationship had ended years earlier, their friendship remained strong. They stayed in regular contact, spent time together, and continued to share their passion for music. Hartford in the summer of 2013 was a typical rural American community, where neighbors knew one another by name and violent crime was almost unheard of. As one local police officer later explained, the town had not experienced a homicide in nearly 3 decades before everything changed. For that very reason, the sense of security the people of Hartford had always taken for granted made the tragedy even more difficult to comprehend. No family in town imagined they would one day face a murder in the middle of an otherwise peaceful summer, let alone that someone connected to the case would be a familiar face, known and trusted throughout the community. The Blodgett family was well known for their kindness and hospitality. Their home was a regular gathering place for Jessie's friends, filled with music rehearsals and late-night conversations. That atmosphere of warmth and complete trust formed the foundation of the close relationship between the two families, a trust that, before long, would be shattered in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. Like so many summers before it, Jessie devoted herself wholeheartedly to the musical production she was performing in, never knowing it would become the final artistic project of her far too short life. During the middle of July 2013, Jessie was in the final days of performing in the local production of Fiddler on the Roof, where she played the role of the fiddler, the symbolic character who appears throughout the musical. It was a busy yet exciting time, as she and the cast spent consecutive evenings rehearsing and performing. 2 days before the tragedy, on 12 July, an apparently unrelated incident took place at a park in Richfield, not far from Hartford. A woman walking her dog was attacked by a young man armed with a knife. She managed to wrestle the weapon away, and the attacker fled in a pickup truck. At the time, no one, including local police, could have imagined that this seemingly isolated assault would later prove to have a direct connection to what was about to happen just 48 hours later. On the evening of 14 July, the final performance of Fiddler on the Roof concluded successfully. As is common for community theatre productions, the cast gathered for a small farewell celebration to mark the end of weeks of rehearsals and performances. The party was filled with laughter, farewell hugs, and promises to meet again for future productions. Jessie left the celebration later than expected. According to police records compiled later, she arrived home at around 1 a.m. And perfectly ordinary time for a university student returning from the closing night of a musical she had spent months preparing for. None of her fellow cast members, who had last seen her full of energy and happiness that evening, could have imagined it would be the last time they would ever see Jessie Blodgett alive. Meanwhile, one of Jessie's close friends was also in the area that night. Security camera footage later showed him near a park not far from Jessie's home. At the time, his presence there raised no suspicion at all. It appeared to be nothing more than a small detail in the larger picture of an otherwise ordinary summer evening in Hartford. Jessie's parents, like many parents of university-aged children, had no particular concerns when their daughter returned home late after the final performance. It was entirely normal for a second-year university student to enjoy the closing night of a production she had poured so much time and passion into over the previous weeks. That night, as Jessie walked through the front door of her home for the final time, the town of Hartford lay peacefully asleep, just as it did on every other summer evening. There were no warning signs, no sense that anything was out of place. Everything appeared to be unfolding according to the familiar rhythm of everyday life until the following morning brought a reality no one could have imagined. No witness ever saw what happened inside Jessie's bedroom in the hours after she returned home. Everything later established came from the crime scene examination, the post-mortem, and the evidence presented in court years later. One detail immediately stood out to investigators. There were no signs of forced entry. The doors and windows were intact, strongly suggesting that the person responsible was someone Jessie knew, someone she may have willingly let into the house without the slightest suspicion. According to the forensic findings later presented in court, Jessie had been bound at both the wrists and ankles, gagged with an improvised restraint, and ultimately strangled with a length of climbing rope. This was specialized equipment, not something typically found by chance in the bedroom of a university student. The type of rope used, combined with the complete absence of signs of a prolonged struggle or a weapon left at the scene, later led prosecutors to argue before the jury that this was not a spontaneous act, but one that had been carefully prepared in advance. The trial judge later echoed that assessment during sentencing. The post-mortem examination also determined that Jessie had been sexually assaulted before her death. Notably, this finding was not disclosed publicly during the early stages of the investigation. It later became a crucial element in helping investigators identify the person responsible. Based on the forensic evidence, investigators concluded that the entire attack likely took place within a relatively short period after Jessie arrived home before anyone else in the household realized that anything was wrong. The complete absence of unusual noises reported by neighbors further supported that conclusion. In a quiet neighborhood like Hartford, where residents would normally notice disturbances during the night, the silence that surrounded the house only deepened the mystery. The tragedy had unfolded just meters away, yet no one nearby had any idea it was happening. Years later, when the case was fully examined in court, the man ultimately convicted never provided a detailed account of exactly what had taken place inside Jessie's bedroom. As a result, a crucial part of the story remains known in full only to the person who carried out the attack. That unanswered gap, combined with the cold certainty of the forensic evidence left behind, became the foundation of the 16-day investigation that followed. On the morning of 15 July 2013, life inside the Blodgett family home followed its usual routine. At around 8 a.m., Jessie's mother, Joy Blodgett, carried some clothes into her daughter's bedroom before leaving for work, a familiar daily habit that gave no indication anything was wrong at the time. She left the house as she normally would, spending the morning at work, completely unaware that inside the bedroom she had entered only minutes earlier, her daughter was lying motionless on the bed. At around midday, when Joy returned home after her shift, she walked into Jessie's bedroom and found her daughter unresponsive. In that horrifying moment, she immediately called 911, her voice breaking as she tried to tell the emergency dispatcher what she had just discovered. Emergency medical personnel and officers from the Hartford Police Department arrived at the scene within minutes. Paramedics confirmed that Jessie had died, and the scene was immediately classified as a case requiring a full criminal investigation rather than what initially might have appeared to be a natural death. News spread rapidly throughout the close-knit Hartford community. In a town that had not experienced a homicide in nearly 3 decades, the death of a young woman as well-known and well-loved as Jessie sent shockwaves through every corner of the community. Lieutenant James Zywicki of the Hartford Police Department, who led the investigation, later said during a television interview that it was the first time in his career the town had been confronted with a homicide of such magnitude, a reflection of just how rare and shocking the case was for the entire local police force. Jessie's fellow cast members, who had been celebrating with her only hours earlier at the farewell party following the final performance, learned the news through phone calls and social media in complete disbelief. Many rushed to the Blodgett family home, hoping simply to be there and offer whatever comfort they could to Jessie's grieving family. The University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where Jesse was studying, was also quickly informed of what had happened. University administrators and faculty members from the theater department, many of whom had taught and worked alongside her on numerous productions, expressed their deep sorrow over the sudden loss of a remarkably promising student who had been admired not only for her talent but also for her commitment to the university's artistic community. Meanwhile, at the scene itself, police began securing the area around the Blodgett home in preparation for a comprehensive forensic examination that would begin shortly afterwards, marking the official start of an investigation that no one in the small town had ever imagined they would witness in their lifetime. For Jesse's father, Buck Blodgett, who was at work when he received the call from his wife, that moment became one of the most painful memories he would carry for the rest of his life. The sudden transition from an ordinary morning at work to the devastating realization that his family's life would never be the same again. As soon as authorities confirmed that the case required a criminal investigation, the Hartford Police Department quickly realized that its scale far exceeded the capabilities of a small local police force that rarely dealt with serious violent crime. They immediately requested assistance from county and state investigative agencies. Crime scene investigators were deployed to conduct a comprehensive forensic examination of the scene, collecting every trace of potential evidence from Jesse's bedroom. The entire house was placed under strict police control, with no one, including members of the Blodgett family, allowed to enter the crime scene until evidence collection had been completed. Investigators swiftly obtained search warrants to examine Jesse's phone records and her entire Facebook activity, where she had shared photographs with fellow cast members from the musical as well as posts about the final performance. This was a standard investigative step, aimed at reconstructing as accurately as possible her relationships, communications, and movements during the final days of her life. At the same time, officers began a door-to-door canvass throughout the neighborhood, asking residents whether they had seen or heard anything unusual on the night of the incident. Police also contacted every member of the cast involved in the musical, along with everyone who had attended the farewell party that evening, to verify Jesse's movements before she returned home. During the first days of the investigation, police had no identified suspect, leaving the entire Hartford community gripped by fear and uncertainty over the possibility that the person responsible was still freely moving about among them. Many local families, particularly those with teenage or young adult daughters, began taking additional safety precautions, locking their doors more carefully and discouraging their children from going out alone at night. The sense of complete security that had long been a source of pride for Hartford was suddenly replaced by a level of vigilance the town had not experienced in recent history. Local newspapers, followed soon afterwards by media outlets across Wisconsin, began reporting extensively on the case, transforming Jesse's story from a private family tragedy into one of the state's most closely watched investigations. Growing public attention, combined with the community's overwhelming desire for answers, placed increasing pressure on investigators to work with greater urgency than ever before. Against that backdrop, every piece of information collected from the final messages Jesse had sent to each frame recovered from security cameras scattered throughout the surrounding area was examined with painstaking care, in the hope that one small detail might ultimately lead investigators closer to the truth behind the young woman's mysterious death. Jesse's body was transported to the Washington County Medical Examiner's Office for a formal post-mortem examination. This was a mandatory step in any death involving suspicious circumstances, providing the scientific foundation for every stage of the investigation that followed. Forensic pathologists worked to establish the estimated time of death using a range of technical methods, comparing their findings with the confirmed time Jesse returned home at approximately 1 a.m., and the time her body was discovered around midday. Narrowing this time frame significantly reduced the period investigators needed to focus on when reconstructing the sequence of events. At the same time, crime scene investigators conducted a thorough collection of physical evidence throughout the house. They gathered fingerprints, fibers, and any biological material that might have remained on the bed, door handles, or other surfaces inside the bedroom. Every item of evidence was packaged, labeled, and preserved under strict chain of custody procedures to ensure its legal integrity should it later be presented in court. However, investigators encountered a major challenge from the very beginning. Most of the evidence recovered from Jesse's bedroom was insufficient to identify a specific suspect. There were no clearly identifiable unknown fingerprints, nor were there unusual hairs or fibers that immediately pointed investigators towards a particular individual. As a result, detectives were forced to broaden their search beyond the house itself, turning their attention to the surrounding area, including a small park not far from Jesse's home that, only days later, would become a location of critical importance in determining the direction of the entire investigation. Forensic specialists also collected samples for DNA analysis, a process that, in 2013, typically required several days before complete results could be obtained. as genetic testing technology was not yet as rapid as it would become in later years. This was one reason why the early stages of the investigation relied heavily on traditional investigative methods, interviews, timeline reconstruction, and behavioral analysis of those connected to the case, while detectives waited for the scientific results to be completed. While forensic testing was still underway, senior investigators were assigned to the case, working closely with the Hartford Police Department and county investigative agencies to ensure that every possible lead was thoroughly examined and that no potential clue capable of bringing the investigation closer to the answers sought by both the Blodgett family and the Hartford community would be overlooked. The pressure of time grew heavier with each passing day as news of the case continued to spread. Both the family and the community desperately wanted answers as quickly as possible. While the inherently complex nature of forensic analysis demanded patience and absolute precision, allowing no mistakes that might later weaken the integrity of the entire investigation. The first clue that ultimately steered the entire investigation towards the truth came from the seemingly unrelated attack at Richfield Park 3 days earlier. Using the detailed description of the pickup truck provided by the woman who had survived that attack, police quickly identified its owner, a 19-year-old man named Daniel Bartelt. As detectives began examining Bartelt's background, they discovered a detail that immediately caught their attention. He had once shared a close relationship with Jessie Blodgett, having dated her during their early years of high school. In a small community like Hartford, where virtually everyone knew one another, that connection could not be overlooked in any serious investigation. Bartelt was brought in for questioning regarding both incidents. During interviews about the attack at the park, he admitted that he had assaulted the woman with a knife, telling investigators that he had wanted to scare someone because everyone around me was too confident. The unusual admission offered an early glimpse into what appeared to be his disturbed state of mind at the time. However, when questioned about Jessie's death, Bartelt categorically denied any involvement. He provided an alibi, claiming that he had been at Woodlawn Union Park on the day the crime occurred. When detectives compared his account with nearby security camera footage, the alibi initially appeared to be supported. He was indeed seen at the park as he had claimed. Yet it was during that lengthy interview that Bartelt inadvertently let slip a seemingly insignificant detail, one that, according to the book later written about the case, had never been released publicly to anyone outside the investigation. Bartelt referred to Jessie as having been raped and murdered, a description that matched exactly what forensic pathologists had already determined but which had not been disclosed to the media or the public at that stage. For the experienced detectives conducting the interview, that became the defining turning point of the entire investigation. Only 3 groups of people could possibly have known that specific detail: the killer, the investigative team, and the forensic specialists who had performed the post-mortem examination. Bartelt belonged to neither of the latter 2 groups. His accidental reference to that undisclosed fact, even if made only in passing, immediately elevated him from one of several possible suspects to the central focus of the investigation. Following that breakthrough, investigators returned to Woodlawn Union Park, where Bartelt had claimed to have been as part of his alibi. This time, rather than simply verifying his presence through security footage, they expanded their search to the surrounding area, including the public rubbish bins scattered throughout the park, a decision that, not long afterwards, would produce the single most decisive piece of evidence in the entire case. From what appeared to be nothing more than an inadvertent remark, the investigation suddenly had both a clearly defined suspect and a specific location on which to concentrate every remaining investigative resource. The search of the public rubbish bins at Woodlawn Union Park quickly produced the results investigators had been hoping for. Inside a discarded cereal box, crime scene technicians discovered a length of rope, several disinfectant wipes stained with blood, and a roll of adhesive tape. Subsequent forensic testing confirmed that these items contained DNA belonging to both Jessie Blodgett and Daniel Bartelt. This was the decisive piece of physical evidence prosecutors needed to move forward with the next stage of the case. Combined with the sensitive detail Bartelt had inadvertently revealed during his earlier police interview, investigators now had sufficient grounds to take formal action. On 17 July 2013, Daniel Bartelt was officially arrested. At this initial stage, the arrest was based on his own admission that he had attacked the woman at Richfield Park on 12 July, an offense he had voluntarily confessed to during his first interview with detectives. Using the assault charge as the basis for the initial arrest was a common legal strategy in complex criminal cases. It allowed authorities to keep the suspect in custody, preventing any possibility of flight or further destruction of evidence while prosecutors continued building the far more serious case directly connected to Jessie's death. Over the following 2 weeks, the State Crime Laboratory conducted comprehensive DNA analysis on all biological evidence recovered from the park, comparing it with reference samples obtained from both the victim and the suspect. On 31 July 2013, After the results were conclusively confirmed, Daniel Bartelt was formally charged with first-degree intentional homicide in connection with the death of Jesse Blodgett. In total, Bartelt faced 4 serious criminal charges, 1 count of first-degree intentional homicide relating to Jesse's death, along with 3 additional charges connected to the earlier attack at Richfield Park, including first-degree recklessly endangering safety and false imprisonment. News of Bartelt's arrest spread rapidly throughout Hartford and the surrounding communities, bringing a measure of relief to residents who had lived in fear for 16 days. Yet for those who knew how close Bartelt had once been to the Blodgett family, the news carried a far more complicated emotional weight, the shock of realizing that the young man who had stood beside them, comforting them during their darkest hours, was now accused of being the very person responsible for the tragedy. At Bartelt's initial detention hearing, the judge denied him bail, citing the seriousness of the charges and the potential risk he posed to public safety if released before trial. He was remanded into custody at the Washington County Jail, where he would remain for more than a year until his case finally proceeded to trial. After being formally charged with murder, Daniel Bartelt continued to attend official interviews with investigators, this time under far more serious legal circumstances than during the initial questioning. Even after being informed that DNA testing had produced a complete match from the items recovered at the park, Bartelt continued to deny any direct involvement in Jesse's death. Before the case could proceed to trial, the court ordered a psychiatric evaluation to determine whether Bartelt was mentally competent to stand trial, a standard procedure in serious criminal cases in the United States, designed to ensure that the accused fully understood the nature of the charges against him and was capable of working effectively with his defense lawyers. Following the assessment, Bartelt was found competent to stand trial, clearing the way for the proceedings to be scheduled for August 2014, more than a year after the crime had taken place. During this lengthy period of waiting, Bartelt's defense team, led by Gary Schmaus, began developing its legal strategy. Faced with DNA evidence that was all but impossible to dispute, the defense was forced to focus on other aspects of the case rather than attempting to deny the scientific evidence linking Bartelt to the investigation. Throughout this period, Bartelt continued to deny responsibility, offering no motive or explanation for what had happened, a silence that remained unbroken right through to the beginning of the trial. Bartelt's family also faced enormous pressure from public attention and media coverage during this time. Jesse's father, Buck Blodgett, later said that he held no hatred towards the Bartelt family, whom he continued to describe as a wonderful family that provided a loving environment, an unusually compassionate perspective that reflected the complicated relationship between two families who had once been close before tragedy struck. Meanwhile, the prosecution continued strengthening its case throughout the year leading up to the trial, preparing for the possibility of lengthy court proceedings in which every piece of evidence would need to be presented logically and convincingly, capable of withstanding whatever challenges the defense might raise before the jury. For the Hartford community, the long wait before the trial proved emotionally difficult. Although local residents already knew the identity of the suspect, they continued living with lingering unease and unanswered questions, as the true motive behind Bartelt's actions remained unknown, and perhaps would never be fully explained by the only person who truly knew. That prolonged silence, combined with the substantial body of scientific evidence already assembled, laid the foundation for a trial whose outcome, in the eyes of many who had followed the case closely, seemed almost inevitable before the proceedings had even begun. The murder trial officially commenced in August 2014 at the Washington County Courthouse in West Bend, Wisconsin, and lasted for approximately 1 week. It marked the point at which the entire body of evidence gathered over more than a year of investigation was formally presented to the jury. The prosecution called multiple forensic experts to testify, confirming the cause of death in detail and reaffirming that DNA testing had produced a complete match between the evidence recovered from the park and both the victim and the accused. Specific details from the crime scene, including confirmation that the length of climbing rope had been the ligature used to kill Jesse, were fully revealed to the public for the first time during these proceedings. The lead prosecutor presented the central argument of the case, that Bartelt had targeted Jesse simply because she was convenient, a chilling interpretation suggesting that his motive did not necessarily stem from deep personal hatred, but rather from the ease of access made possible by the relationship the two had shared in the past. Jesse's friends were also called to testify, providing further context about her relationship with Bartelt in the months leading up to the crime. Several witnesses revealed that Bartelt had recently tried to rekindle a romantic relationship with Jesse, but that she did not share those feelings, a detail the prosecution used as part of the broader picture of his possible motive. Meanwhile, the defense team failed to present a sufficiently persuasive argument to counter the substantial volume of scientific evidence. Instead, their strategy focused primarily on emphasizing their client's right to a fair trial, rather than attempting to construct an entirely different account of what had happened. Throughout the week-long trial, the courtroom remained filled with attendees, including members of both the Blodgett and Bartelt families, as well as a large number of journalists from news organizations across the region. An atmosphere of tension hung over each day of the proceedings as every piece of evidence presented gradually tightened the legal case against the accused. By the end of the trial, after both sides had concluded their presentations, the 12-member jury prepared to retire for final deliberations, the moment that both families, along with the entire Hartford community, had been waiting for throughout the long years since the tragedy had unfolded. The 12-member jury deliberated for only about 3 hours before reaching a verdict. At approximately 2:30 p.m., on 19 August 2014, Judge Todd Martins read the decision aloud before a packed courtroom. Daniel Bartelt was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. As the verdict was announced, emotions overflowed on both sides of the courtroom, where those who had once known the two former classmates witnessed the heartbreaking end of a relationship that had once been close. Remarkably, members of the Blodgett and Bartelt families embraced one another before leaving the courtroom, a rare sight in the aftermath of such a serious murder trial. Speaking to reporters immediately after the trial, Buck Blodgett said, "This is not a good day for anybody." Referring to the Bartelt family, he added, "Dan's family is a beautiful family that provided a loving environment. They're good people. My heart absolutely breaks for them today. This is a tremendous loss for everyone." About 2 months later, on 14 October 2014, the formal sentencing hearing took place in the same courthouse. Judge Martins sentenced Bartelt to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, emphasizing that the seriousness of the crime, the degree of planning involved, and its brutality justified ensuring the Blodgett family would know the defendant would never again have the opportunity to endanger anyone else. At the sentencing hearing, Bartelt was given the opportunity to address the court. Speaking to Jesse's parents, he said, "I can't give you the reason you're looking for. You can't run away from yourself in a small concrete prison cell." He maintained that wearing prison clothes and handcuffs did not mean he was guilty, although he acknowledged that there was evidence he could not refute. Perhaps the most remarkable moment of the sentencing came from Buck Blodgett himself. Addressing Bartelt directly, he told him that he had forgiven him. "I not only forgive you, I love you as well." He later explained that this was not an attempt to maintain a friendship with the man who had taken his daughter's life, but a deliberate act reflecting the message he wanted to bring into the world, one completely opposite to what Bartelt had done and taken away. More than a decade has passed since Jessie Blodgett was taken from this world, yet the legacy she left behind continues to reach people in ways that she herself may never have imagined during her lifetime. In 2016, Jessie's father, Buck Blodgett, founded the Love is Greater Than Hate project in her memory, determined to continue the very mission that had become so important to her. During the final 1 or 2 years of her life, Jessie had spoken openly about violence against women, a cause that, according to her father, had become the last great mission of her life. Tragically, she would become a victim of the very form of violence she had spoken out against, at the hands of someone she had trusted and considered a close friend for many years. As of today, Daniel Bartelt remains imprisoned at the Waupun Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, serving a sentence of life without parole. Throughout the years, he has never changed his account, continuing to maintain his innocence despite the substantial body of scientific evidence that was presented before the court and the jury. Jessie Blodgett's story is more than a criminal case. It is a painful reminder that the line between friendship and danger can sometimes be so thin that no one, not even those closest to us, recognizes it until it is far too late. The person who once sat beside her in class, wrote music with her, and was warmly welcomed into her family's home ultimately became the one responsible for the most devastating tragedy of her life. For the Blodgett family, the journey of healing will likely never be truly complete. Yet rather than allowing grief to become hatred, they chose a different path, transforming loss into action and personal tragedy into a legacy with a greater purpose, continuing to inspire future generations in the fight against violence against women. Just as Jessie had hoped to do during her lifetime, the case also leaves behind a haunting question for everyone who hears Jessie's story. Were there warning signs that the community, the family, or even Jessie herself failed to recognize? In Bartelt's case, he had been described as an outstanding student who came from a loving family. No one, not even those who knew him best, had recognized the signs of the darkness that was quietly growing within him. Perhaps that is the most painful and unsettling lesson left behind by the Jessie Blodgett case. Sometimes, the greatest danger does not come from strangers, but from the familiar faces we trust the most.